fellow alumni, and especially the Penn Club who's sneaking in as we speak. And we have a very distinguished speaker with us today, Doug Codiga. We've read about, I believe, in the email, is going to talk about the law and the environment and what's going on, and what challenges and what's the opportunities, among other things. And Doug is a well-known legal practitioner here in Honolulu, and absolute expert and authority when it comes to this. Well, I guess we'll be the judge of that when it comes to this subject matter. Again, thank you all for coming, and we'll have Doug have at it. We're being, Jay Fidel has asked if he can tape this today for, I guess, Olelo, or what does he use?
I think this will be on his website.
Okay.
ThinkTech.
ThinkTech. Thanks very much. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Archie. Excuse me.
Sure. Oh.
Throw this in your pocket. Easiest way.
I've got to find out. We're going to have to do it. You did a really great thing. I stuck in and you recognized me. You stuck in and you didn't see me. I'm going to write an email today.
That'd be great. Wow, October's perfect. I got nothing wrong with it.
Good. That one we have safe tonight at the end of the
Well, thank you, Archie, for that very kind and generous introduction. And good afternoon. Aloha to all of you here. Thank you all for taking time to attend this presentation. As Archie said, my name is Doug Codiga. I'm an attorney in private practice here in Honolulu, practicing environmental laws for about the last 15 years in private practice and teaching at the law school, environmental law courses, and more recently doing more work in energy law and policy, and that's going to be the focus of our presentation today. I have to say at the outset that, what I find when I give these presentations, there are always a handful of people. In fact, in this room, there may be more than a handful of people who have tremendous expertise in these areas. And so this will be a chance, we'll have a little Q&A and a chance for us to dialogue and people to contribute to this conversation. On the other hand, sometimes there's people who have no familiarity with the topic at all, or very little familiarity, although I suspect in this room most of us have some familiarity, in part because it's happening. There's a lot of activity in this area in all different sectors of our society here in the islands. So I'm going to go pretty quickly. I'm going to try to touch upon major developments. This is called recent developments, but you'll see some of them are not so recent, really, probably dating back to a couple years or so. But I'm going to try to give you some good background information and then touch upon some recent developments. I encourage you to ask questions during my presentation if you want to throw something at me during the talk, and I'll try to save some time at the end so that we can have some discussion. As I'm sure some of you, more than a few of you, have some things that you might want to share that would be of benefit to others. Can I ask you, Archie, what time we want to target? Time is 1 p.m. or?
We try to promise that everybody can be back in their office by 1:30.
Oh, I see.
So
Okay.
1:15 we should.
Oh, I see. Okay, great. Very good. Well, let's just get to it then. I always like to start with the, with the big picture. It doesn't get any bigger than this. This is a familiar image, inspiring to many, and with regard to environmental protection, evokes a range of different reactions on different topics. The reason I'm presenting it to you here now is maybe not quite what you would expect, which is to emphasize the atmosphere. The Earth's atmosphere, about 75% of the mass of the Earth's atmosphere is merely 6 miles above the surface of the Earth. So we're looking at a planet with a very fragile, thin film, if you will, almost a very thin film of atmosphere. Why does this matter for a talk on clean energy law? Because climate is one of the key drivers of clean energy law and policy. And in fact, I'm going to spend the first part of my talk focusing on climate change because it is closely related and it's a major driver of clean energy law and policy. So I'd like to begin with this. This is the big picture. We're looking at, in economics terms, the perfect negative externality with carbon emissions. We're looking at a truly global problem. We're looking at carbon emissions that enter the atmosphere, do not stay regionally located or nationally located. It's a global issue that needs to be confronted on a global level, and we see that starting to happen as well as being dealt with on a local, very local level. Okay, here is a picture of Mauna Loa volcano on the Big Island. What's the connection? Well, of course, this is where Charles Keeling conducted his scientific experiments in an effort to gather evidence to support the hypothesis that carbon emissions stemming from the Industrial Revolution and burning fossil fuels, coal, to a lesser extent oil, were contributing to climate change. This is where he captured samples from the atmosphere for the purpose of establishing this important scientific hypothesis. This was viewed by him as being an ideal place to gather these samples, being far removed from typical sources of emissions, and he spent quite a bit of time up there doing that, and that was in the 1950s and 1960s, and of course that led to the very basic notion, a foundational scientific notion, that carbon emissions do contribute to climate change. This graph shows emissions from 1960 through 2000, and we can see the steady increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide as measured at Mauna Loa, Hawaii. So, you know, this is kind of symbolic, but it suggests that Hawaii does have a special connection to the climate issue, which is driving clean energy. And we'll see also, as I discuss the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, that there's some, and even in statutory law, there's some sense conveyed that we are going to seek to be a model for the world, that Hawaii would seek to be a kind of a model for the world in addressing climate change and in promoting clean energy. These are just a couple other slides I like to present showing the increase in temperature over the last 1,000-year period or so, and this may be very familiar to many of you. And of course, we see that that correlates very closely with increase in carbon dioxide concentrations. Again, a very simple presentation that just helps us to remember some of the basic sort of factors at play in the climate issue. This is the Arctic sea ice melt in the summer of 1980. This is 2007. Again, many of these images are familiar to us. But again, these are the kind of images that I find popping up in more sort of popular consumption venues just to drive home the point that we're dealing with a very serious issue. I will not be talking today about the scientific controversy around climate change. Of course, there remains some relatively small, I think, controversy around the science. I'm just a lawyer. If the legislature passes it and finds a basis for it, that's enough for me. Others of you may feel differently, and I respect that, but I won't be able to spend too much time on that today. So let's look at Hawaii, again, focusing on the climate part before we get to the energy part, the context for state climate change laws, in particular Act 234, Hawaii's climate change law, which is what I'm going to speak about. Before I do that, can I ask, just a show of hands, who in this room has heard of Act 234, Hawaii's climate change law? And I would expect it to be not very many of you. Has anybody heard of Act 234, Hawaii's climate change law? One, two, anybody else? This is good. So this will be helpful today. Hopefully. We actually have one of the nation's leading climate change laws, and it's kind of a well-kept secret. The context for that law: widespread scientific agreement about climate change, public awareness. You have charismatic megafauna. You've got polar bears losing their habitat. You've got island atolls disappearing under the waves. In the U.S., lack of international and federal laws. Of course, the Senate continues to struggle to pass legislation that would put a price on carbon, which is essential. We have the Kyoto Protocol, which is a well-established international model. And in the U.S., we see sprouting up these regional initiatives where different states and industries around the country are attempting to form Kyoto Protocol-like regimes to govern the emissions, these greenhouse gas emissions. The Western Climate Initiative, RGGI is a regional greenhouse gas initiative, which is along the East Coast. It's states and power producers that burn coal that have agreed to set up a cap and trade kind of a system, and then the Midwest Greenhouse Gas Reduction Association as well. Of course, the downside of doing this, of not having federal statute that puts a price on carbon, is you have the so-called patchwork quilt. You have these uneven regulatory regimes. National industries have to deal with different regulatory regimes in each state or region, and this is viewed as inefficient and possibly harmful to business. But anyways, this is sort of the context in which Act 234 arose. And Act 234 is Hawaii's climate change law. It is among the first in the nation. The legislature concluded that Climate change is a, quote, serious threat to the economic well-being, public health, natural resources, and to the environment of Hawaii. This is a conclusion by the state legislature in adopting the law in 2007. Some of the things they pointed to: rising sea levels, freshwater aquifer inundation, drought, storms, harm to tourism, agriculture, recreation, commercial fishing, and forestry. This is part of the, this is in the statute. This is what the legislature has concluded. Modeled to a certain extent, as often happens, on what's happening in California, the California Global Warming Solutions Act, AB 32. Similar laws being adopted in Washington, New Jersey, and Florida. Of course, many of you may have seen in the news, AB 32 is now under attack in California. There are forces to trying to essentially nullify that law based on economic reasons. So a very dynamic area. California took the lead. Of course, Governor Schwarzenegger, many viewed, just as a sidebar, many viewed his efforts to use clean energy and climate change as signature issues of his administration as a way of reaching out to moderates and independents and sort of taking advantage of the political capital, if you will, that was presented by that opportunity. And I think that was noticed by other political leaders in other parts of the country, that he had some real success with regard to his own political operations by embracing renewable, clean energy and climate change issues. Here, back home here in Hawaii, we found for HB 226, which is our Act 234, broad bipartisan support at the time, 48 to 2 in the House and 22 to 3 in the Senate. So widespread agreement that this was a good thing to do. What exactly did it do? Well, it was attempting, and by the way, I put these slides in here just to emphasize more of the background. Maybe some of you have seen this as well. This is prepared by the University of Hawaii, I believe. I think they put this together, but it shows basically about a 1 meter sea level rise in Waikiki. We all recognize this, of course, as Waikiki with the Alawai Canal, and this is about a 1 meter sea level rise if left unchecked by adaptation.
Oh,
So,
projected then.
projected, yes. Of course, this gets people's attention. So this is part of the context for Act 234. This is just an image of storm surge that illustrates how, potentially how this could impact Waikiki and going forward, one of our key economic engines. So what does the law do? It adopts an emissions limit, basically just like the Kyoto Protocol. Got to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by January 1, 2020. Interestingly, aviation fuel and bunker fuel were exempted. Here's the part that lawyers like. Greenhouse gas limits on, quote, sources or categories of sources. What does that mean? Anything you want it to. It's extremely broad. That gets people's attention. So that means all kinds of different sources can potentially be regulated by this law. It requires reporting and verification. Of course, first you have to report, right? You have to report the emissions first. Why? Because that leads to mitigation. That's the foundation for mitigation. So it requires reporting. We'll see in a moment. I'll talk about what's happening at the federal level, and there already is some EPA reporting requirements that have been triggered. Administrative rules by December 31st, 2011. Now, here's why you may not have heard of Act 234. The rules are not yet adopted. And so, of course, the rules contain the details that help parties to evaluate whether they're going to be impacted or not and to what extent. So the rulemaking procedure probably will generate more attention on the part of the regulated community. There's a question, and I'll show you in just a moment why. There's actually a question right now. It's unclear to me personally as to whether we will have rules or whether the task force that's working on this will ask the legislature to postpone rulemaking, and I'll explain why in just a second. Okay, the task force I mentioned, DOH, DBED, UH, HECO, MAPS, and Tesoro, Blue Planet Foundation, client of mine doing clean energy advocacy work, Nature Conservancy. They said, okay, they got together. First thing, got to do an inventory. They took an inventory from 1996, got a consultant, tuned that up. You have to have a baseline. If you're going to figure out how much you're going to reduce your emissions, you have to have a baseline. So they got that in place. They figured out 1990 levels, 13.660 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's our baseline from 1990. And they said, okay, let's do a work plan and figure out how we're going to get there. And guess what? The work plan concluded. And this this is sort of the bridge from the climate to the clean energy. Well, you've probably all heard, or most of you have heard of the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, and the signature initiative. The consultant concluded, essentially, that, well, one of the several conclusions of the consultant was, and the task force was, if we do everything we're committed to doing under the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, if we actually do all that, we're okay. We will actually meet the requirement. We'll meet the requirement of Act 234 if we achieve all of the objectives of the HCI. Now, when I get to the clean energy part, you'll see there may be some questions as to how easy it's going to be to actually do that, because of the different complexities with the different policies. But that was sort of the conclusion. They actually came up with 3 work plans, HCEI Plus, which was doing more than that. And they also looked at a carbon tax and cap and trade, which of course have generated a lot of discussion on the national level. We've all heard about cap and trade, or cap and tax as it's sometimes referred to. Carbon tax, that doesn't get as much discussion, but those of you who are kind of following these issues know that it's been proposed that we just have a fee. It's like a broadband fee. It's a fee for carbon emissions, so very similar to that, like kind of a tax on carbon emissions. So the work plan looked at those as well, but we'll focus on this HCEI Plus here. They also recommended that we go beyond the 1990 level to do even 40% more than that. So there's a forward-looking conclusion as well from this task force that was put together. Here's another thing, again, focusing on law and policy for today. You know, the Act 234 has this basic requirement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So where does that go in our statutory scheme? It goes right into our Hawaii State Clean Air Act. We have a Hawaii State Clean Air Act, just like the Federal Clean Air Act. So they took the key provisions from Act 234 and they just imported them right over into our Clean Air Act. Because you think about it, these are greenhouse gas emissions, just like other kinds of particulate matter or other types of pollutants. So we just put it right over in 342B, our State Clean Air Act, no problem. Here's the kicker. The same penalties apply now. So we need to be thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, not as a sort of ethereal, invisible, can't taste, can't smell, can't touch emissions. We need to think about them the same way as we think about emissions coming out of the tailpipe of a car, for example, or other types of emissions. If we do have a permitting regime and you have to get a permit for your greenhouse gas emissions, you violate the permit, $25,000 per day per offense, just like the Clean Air Act. Criminal penalties as well. And here's the thing that's really interesting. Very few statutes in Hawaii authorize what we call a citizen suit. Some of you have heard of this. The Clean Air Act, our State Clean Air Act, does authorize citizen suits. This means that a citizen has the right to go to court and to seek to enforce the law. They're not going to be barred from court because they don't have a specific or particular interest in the case. They're just a citizen. They want to enforce the law. They can go right into court. I'm simplifying, but basically they can go right into court and sue, and then indeed they can be awarded their attorney's fees. Attorney's fees are always a stumbling block for citizen litigation. How are they going to afford the attorney and so forth? Well, this statute authorizes the court to have the discretion anyways to award attorney's fees. So there's a citizen suit provision. So all I'm saying basically is that it has teeth. The law has teeth. The Act 234 in the Clean Air Act. So let's leave that aside and go on to some other ways in which this whole climate change issue may play out in Hawaii. Everyone has probably heard of Chapter 343, our environmental impact review law. This is the law that, if you're going to build a hotel or a golf course or anything, basically, you have to do an environmental assessment, and oftentimes for larger projects, an environmental impact impact statement. So not yet, but last couple of years, there's been attempts to amend that law to require not only traffic and sewage and endangered species and all the things that you would normally look at in doing an EIS, but greenhouse gas emissions. So the law was attempted to be amended to say if there's the projects, one of the factors you look at is their quote-unquote substantial energy consumption or greenhouse gas emissions. And also, does it increase the scope or intensity of public hazards, such as coastal inundation, flooding, and erosion, and so forth? This is linked to sea level rise, greenhouse gas emissions and sea level rise. So, right now 343 does not require the party to look at greenhouse gas emissions, at least as far as I can think right now. There may be some way to make an argument, but now California, many states are already down that path. So those of you who are doing development projects and you interact with Chapter 343, you should start thinking greenhouse gas emissions are probably going to be part of that. In other states right now, it's already the case. There's been litigation, federal, state litigation on even, I think a case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, but I'm not sure about that. Anyways, there's been litigation on, for example, large resort development in the desert, Southern California. They want to go ahead with the development. They get sued by a citizens group, says you didn't look at the greenhouse gas emissions. The court stops the project. Go back, look at the greenhouse gas emissions. So anyways, just give you a sense of that. I'm going to talk more about green building a little bit later. I mentioned the Endangered Species Act. So coral species, so you have greenhouse gas emissions are acidifying the ocean. This affects the formation of coral. So you've got citizens groups, environmental groups saying, hey, there's species that are listed or should be listed because of climate change. You got to list these species. Why? Because you're harming them. This is very difficult. The same thing with the polar bear, of course, right now. Litigation to prove that coal-burning power plants are putting these emissions out, which are essentially destroying the polar bear's habitat by reducing the ice cover. Right? Same basic idea, but the Hawaii version of that would be listing and protecting coral species. Very similar move. This is kind of obscure, but under the Clean Water Act, if a body of water is what they call impaired, like if you think about somewhere maybe on the mainland where there's a large river with a bunch of pollution going into it, the EPA will say, well, or a bay, maybe a bay is better, that body of water is quote unquote impaired, so we're going to draw a circle around it and say you can't put any more pollutants in it. It's under Section 303D. Well, clever environmental groups have said, and I think they've had a solid basis for saying so, hey, you've got impaired near-shore ocean waters in Hawaii. Why? Because of the the greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide. It's acidifying the ocean and it's impairing, so you should stop the emissions. So you can see where all this is going, right? It's the usual thing that we do in the U.S. We look to the law to a certain extent to enforce social policies and environmental policies. You got people focused on this issue and they're looking for almost any handle they can get to achieve their aims in that way. And certainly there's been progress made. This is just a slide I put in to illustrate sort of in very general terms our current situation. This of course is an oil tanker bringing us our oil we're extremely dependent on. And this is an oil burning power plant on the leeward side of the island. And this is sort of where many of us are hoping that we move more toward solar, wave, biomass, and wind, renewable energy. So this is the basic transition. So I've kind of done with the climate part for the most part. And let's talk now about the clean energy side. Again, I think to me there are really two sides of the coin. When I give these talks, I almost, they have to be sort of addressed together because they're so closely interrelated. But there's other drivers. There's other drivers, in particular economic drivers, which I will talk about in just a moment. It's not just let's do something good for the environment and mitigate these greenhouse gas emissions for the sake of doing that. There's also very strong economic drivers, particularly in Hawaii. So I say major transition is underway. Now, whenever I give these talks, I always say, please put a question mark at the end of that. Major transition is underway. And the reason why is because for many of us, we're sitting here going, yes, yes, we've been here before, right? Like, yes, yes, So that's the interesting thing now is you have to ask yourself, what has changed, if anything? And I'd like to discuss and debate that with you. We can see what we conclude. What has changed now? Is it true that a major transition is underway, or not quite yet, or never, or what? Something to think about. I'm going to propose to you that a major transition is underway based on what I'm doing and seeing. The transition, of course, is from fossil fuels, particularly imported fossil fuels in Hawaii. Everything's imported, to quote-unquote clean energy. Clean energy, what is that? I wrote an article for the Hawaii Bar Journal last year. I wanted it to be on renewable energy law and development projects. So I said, so the title was going to be renewable energy law, which I'm comfortable with. Everybody is comfortable with that term. Clean energy sounds jargony, sounds kind of not, why clean, what is the, it sounds kind of, so I struggled with that. The title of my article ended up being Hawaii Clean Energy Law and Policy. And the reason why is because this term has actually become a real term, and it's a very simple meaning. It's just simply renewable energy plus energy efficiency combined are what we call clean energy. And I've been thinking about why has that term arisen and gotten traction. I think really the reason is that transitioning from fossil fuels to something else is just enormous. It's just an enormous transition. It will take decades. And you can't do it just with renewable energy, and you can't do it just with energy efficiency. You have to do it with both. And so I think we continue, as we think about this more and more, we realize, oh gosh, it actually is both renewables plus energy efficiency, and it makes sense. It makes sense to talk of them as clean energy, and that's what I do here in this talk. And it applies. I'm going to focus on electricity production and transportation. Those are the two big areas for this transition. All right. So, two sets of drivers, environmental and economic. And by the way, this is one of those unusual times when it seems that the environmental and economic drivers are actually somewhat aligned. Oftentimes when we think of quote-unquote environmental protection, we think of groups in our community that wish to oppose some kind of development that might generate income or some sort of economic development in very broad terms. So there's a basic oppositional sort of force there. With regard to clean energy, of course, that's still true. The closer you look, you find more of that, of course. If you get into the nitty-gritty of actually doing a renewable energy development project, you will find opposition of the same kind. Broadly speaking, however, it looks like, and this is because of the price of oil, it looks like the environmental drivers to mitigate climate change particularly, and the economic drivers to save money are really kind of aligned when we're talking about clean energy. The main environmental driver is, we just talked about, the Act 234 and the 342B now, got to get down to 1990 levels by 2020. Federal level, these are the titles of two pieces of federal legislation, Waxman-Markey, commonly referred to as Waxman-Markey here, passed out of the House, and of course the American Power Act, the plug was just pulled on that by the U.S. Senate several weeks ago. The U.S. Senate seems unable to do what many clean energy advocates would like them to do, which is to put a price on carbon, basically, to meaningfully address the climate change issue and to promote clean energy. There's a sense that that would be appropriate. It has not happened. Anybody's guess as to when and how that will happen. But there's a sense that it's necessary. Some observers view this as contributing to China's ability to move aggressively into the clean energy space. The U.S. There's a sense that the basic argument is that if the Senate would put a price on carbon, that would send a signal to industry, and industry would move ahead with investment and innovation to develop these kinds of replacement technologies. Without a price on carbon, we're kind of like missing something quite essential to the whole operation. Interestingly now, because of this lack of development in the Senate and the House to a certain extent, we're looking at things shifting over toward EPA, and I actually just put together a slide this morning on what's happening with the EPA, which I think is worth addressing just real quickly. Famous U.S. Supreme Court, Massachusetts v. EPA. The issue before the court was whether greenhouse gas emissions should be regulated. Hey, Bill. should be regulated under the Clean Air Act. And the Supreme Court concluded, yes, they should be, yes, they are. They do endanger health, and they should be regulated as a pollutant, a landmark decision. So let's talk a little bit about that, just to give us a little more context for that. After that decision came out, well, some of you may know this, the Bush administration did not move quickly after the U.S. Supreme Court decision to the EPA under the Bush administration did not move quickly to sort of take action following that Supreme Court decision. More recently, we've had an endangerment finding, which is critical to the EPA taking action. In other words, they had concluded that greenhouse gas emissions are harmful to health, which is it's a basic prerequisite before you can regulate a pollution. You have to make this basic determination. You may have heard about this because there was some discussion and some effort in the Senate to block it through amendment. And then the reporting requirement, I said a little while ago, first you report, then you mitigate. So they're on to that. EPA reporting requirement was developed October 30th, 2009. There's a fairly large threshold, 25,000 metric tons. The Department of Health here has identified about 35 different facilities that may be affected by this reporting requirement. And annual reporting begins March 31st, 2011. So again, you can see the direction on the climate issue and how that's going to drive things. New vehicle emission standards were developed in April of this year. You may have seen this generated a lot of press. They raised fuel economy standards to 35 miles per gallon, so that's another EPA initiative. And then the stationary sources are also facing revised emission standards, fairly large threshold, 100,000 tons per year, and they have to install a best available control technology. So I just wanted to throw this at you because it gives you more of a sense that not only on the state level with our Act 234, but also on the federal level, assuming Congress does take meaningful action on the issue at some point, and even, this is partly why the discussion was, well, hey, EPA is going to step forward and try to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, even though it may be a total nightmare, because it would literally, depending on how you set that threshold, it could affect millions and millions of businesses, right? And can you imagine EPA having to issue permits and regulate millions and millions of sources? We would want to avoid that if we could. Therefore, Congress should be motivated to take action. Well, that hasn't happened, really, and so EPA is moving ahead to regulate these emissions. So that's kind of the reality right now. Okay, good.
Can you briefly describe how the 35 facilities are being selected?
No, it was a rough cut by the DOH, based on, probably based, I don't know. I would imagine it was based on existing permits, and they identified in the permit the level of emissions, and they just did a rough cut. That's the extent of my knowledge about it. Yeah.
Is that the state DOH?
Yes, state DOH. Yeah.
So do they have a list that's available?
I think they might be able to provide something like that. Yeah, I was told that, and it was like roughly 35. So yeah. I think so. Okay, so economic drivers. Hawaii gets 77% of its electricity from petroleum, 95% of our transportation fuels, highest electricity prices in the United States. The figure that's tossed around all the time when oil was kind of peaking at 140 that was in 2007, 6.21 billion, or about 10% of our gross state product. This is the figure that most people go, that's a lot of money for a relatively small state. $6.21 billion. That's what's going out of our pockets, at least when oil is, it ranges, of course, depending on the price each year. But even with the fluctuation, I think anyone would be hard-pressed to argue that it's not a significant factor in our economy. In fact, I surveyed all of the Hawaii revised statutes that have anything to do with renewable energy, and put together my sort of hit list of favorite state pronouncements by the legislature in this area. One of them, the strongest, and the lawyers know this, is the best basis to defend any kind of government action is threat to public health and safety. It doesn't get much stronger than that. The legislature has concluded that our dependence on imported oil from places quite far away and given the demand on those sources from other parts of the world, that it actually is a quote-unquote threat to public health and safety. That's a strong statement. It's a very strong statement. And there are many, many other similar kinds of statements in the Hawaii rights statutes. The legislature has recognized this as a problem for a long time. Now, whether we've been able to address it successfully, that's for you to decide. So those are the economic drivers. Here's a graph showing this is a slide from the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative a presentation that they do. TEDPEC does, borrowed from TEDPEC. Credit to TEDPEC. This just shows, the point of this slide is just to show that since 1970 to 2009, we haven't been able to do it. We're still above 85%. Our petroleum consumption is still above. Despite these, you can't really see the colors very well here, but this just shows different sources: PV, photovoltaic, wind, hydro, geothermal, solar, waste, biomass, coal, and so forth. The colors show the different proportions, which have changed over time, which is encouraging. But the bottom line is, we're still at over 85% right now for that. So, contributes to as an economic driver. Let's talk about the HCEI. This grew out of a January 2008 memorandum of understanding between the U.S. Department of Energy and Hawaii. Stepping back, like the big picture on the HCEI is essentially that there was a sense that Hawaii was two things. One, it was actually moving in some good directions with regard to energy policy and making efforts to cultivate and encourage renewables and energy efficiency. Maybe it could do a little bit more, but sort of things were happening at the state level. And at the same time, there was a sense that if extra attention was paid to Hawaii by the U.S. government, DOE in particular, that maybe that would support and encourage this. So it was kind of a meeting of the minds with the state and the Department of Energy to form this Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative. And again, I mentioned earlier in this talk that there's a sense that Hawaii could be a model. This was part of that as well. The MOUs sort of established the foundation. The more meaningful, perhaps, document and much more detailed document was what we refer to as the Energy Agreement, October 20th, 2008, the Energy Agreement. And that is a rather very detailed agreement which sets forth a whole range of different initiatives that the parties to the agreement agreed to undertake. The parties being, of course, the Hawaiian electric companies and the state and the DOE, signed by Governor Lingle. So it is a very exciting landmark agreement that puts out very specific initiatives and programs and projects that are to be undertaken by these parties. They make a commitment to themselves to undertake these agreements. It's essentially an accord, an agreement, not official state policy, not regulation, not law, but viewed by many in this area as being extremely important, and certainly worth having a look at if you're interested in more about how we're going to chart this course forward. Some strong, very very positive language in the document about moving Hawaii decisively and irreversibly to clean energy, something that we do for us and for future generations. So there's this sort of acknowledgement that these are critically important issues, as well as a host of detailed initiatives. The signature commitment, 70% clean energy by 2030. And I just ask for a show of hands. Has anyone heard of that? 70% by 2030? Many of you? Many of you. Okay, so that kind of penetrated, kind of heard of the 70% by 2030. So we'll talk more about that. I have here legally enforceable because it's really not. I mean, even the parties, there's even a clause at the very end for the parties to the agreement outlining whether and under what circumstances they can enforce it against each other, right? So for other parties, basically a private accord. Here's a slide from their presentation, Transforming Hawaii's Energy System. Another slide describing it in their terms, 70% clean energy, increase Hawaii's security. Energy security has become a very important issue. There's conservative Republican senators who go to their town hall meetings on the mainland and they ask, how many of you are concerned about climate change? And 3 people raise their hand, and then they say, and then the senator will say, how many of you are concerned about energy security and would like for us to not be dependent on oil from the Middle East? And everybody raises their hand. So energy security is an important theme, a very important theme. Economic benefits, capture the economic benefits for all levels of society, innovation, build the workforce, green jobs, and then serve as a model for the U.S. and the world. So this is sort of the vision behind the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative. I throw this in because, I have to get the date for this. I think it was 1905. This is an article from, we're going to have wind power. And it's going to be great. So it's, we have these Hawaii Clean Energy, and we have different initiatives. And what year will Hawaii have achieved energy? By what year? You can guess. What year will Hawaii have achieved?
2004. 1990.
1990.
You guys are 2010. We needed a little more time, So that's why I'm giving this talk. See, this shows you here how where the different sources, how we're gonna do it. We're done. Aren't you glad we did that?
Big Island, 1990.
So does that would include bunker fuel?
I don't know. It's a
Because
good
it
question.
only exempts airline fuel.
Yeah, I haven't studied it. So, but anyways, I throw those in because we all know, Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative sounds great. Is it really going to happen? What are we going to do? And for me as a lawyer, it's like, where's the handle? Where's the lever points in the law that we can use to get this done? Okay, the key, one of the most important initiatives coming out of the HCI is the Feed-In Tariff. Sorry for the show of hands thing, but I'm just curious because it's such an odd bird. Has anyone heard of the Feed-In Tariff? Okay, a few of you. This is hard. Well, first of all, it's a terrible name. The Universal Agreement about Feed-In Tariffs is it's the number one renewable energy policy in the world. It's the most widely used in the world. And it's also, the Universal Agreement about Feed-In Tariffs is that the name is absolutely terrible. The name is confusing. It's like, it doesn't matter how many, I could talk about it for the next 20 minutes and it's a translation from the German. And the concept, well, first of all, tariff does not mean tax. Tariff just means agreement. Just think contract or agreement. Feed-in, this is the German, you can just picture, you can almost imagine the translation, right? But feed-in, if you think about our grid, how does the grid work? You got a power station, you got a home or a building or an office, right? It produces energy, energy goes to the user, basically, right? And that's the grid. So we have the grid system with a central station, power generation, and a grid system. Feed-in doesn't really make much sense in that context. Why? Because you have this power station that's just providing the power. What's the feeding in part? Well, this revisions that. This revisions that to suggest that each of us in this room, and I know some of you have solar systems on your homes, that basically we would have what's called, instead of central station generation, we would have distributed generation, or maybe a mix of both, really. But we'd have more distributed generation. The distributed people need to feed in. They need to feed their power into the grid, hence feed-in tariff. So feed-in tariff is basically just an agreement whereby distributed generation sources like your house with a solar system on it or some small independent power producer can feed in their energy into the grid. Why is that an issue? Well, because the current system favors central station generation. Feeding in a bunch of stuff into my grid is not necessarily going to make things operate as smoothly or as well. It's a challenge. It's an operational challenge. So the feed-in tariff attempts to address that by essentially requiring the utility to allow these homes with solar systems to feed into the grid. That's the basic idea. We have a docket at the Public Utilities Commission. I represent the Blue Planet Foundation, one of the intervener parties. There are 22 parties in the docket. The feed-in tariff was initially hoped to be completed under the schedule by summer of 2009. We are still awaiting a final decision from the Commission adopting the tariff for the smaller size projects. It's turned into a huge kind of a proceeding which is involving all kinds of interesting energy policy issues. But Hawaii is among the first states in the nation to try to do this. So it's to our credit, I think, that we're forging ahead with the feed-in tariff. Europe, it's been highly successful. Germany, Spain.
What does that mean when when that section where it says rates differentiated by technology and based on cost plus reasonable profit? How does that work?
Oh, here?
Yeah.
Uh,
How does that work for
well-
Line Electric? I mean,
Well, these are, but see, these are, I'm sorry.
how does that factor into what they have to pay for the electricity?
That's a good question. Let me go through just the basic design, how it works, but basically, the main thing is the utility is required to purchase the energy. You get a 20-year contract with standard terms and conditions. That's a long time. That's good for financing. You go to the bank, hey, I got 20 years, I got an income stream, it's locked in. Can you give me a loan? Yes, of course. 20 years locked in, great. Our feed-in tariff selected only 4 technologies. There was a lot of discussion and debate about which technology: solar PV, concentrating solar, wind, and inline hydro. Project sizes in 3 tiers: very small, single-family rooftop, less than 20 kW. Tier 2 are the kind of the medium-sized projects for Hawaii, anyways. I mean, mainland, these are all really small. For Hawaii, up to half a megawatt, and then Tier 3 goes up to 5 megawatts, which is fairly large IPP. So, and then they also established what's called a baseline feed-in tariff for all the other. If you can do your project at the lowest rate for any other technology, then you can qualify for the feed-in tariff. Rates are critical. Now, getting to your question.
Could you say more about the other technologies? What
Geothermal.
So
Yeah.
Does that mean that then you would get the same rates that the 4 technologies listed there are?
If you can do a geothermal project at the lowest rate for any island within your project size, like say your project is 3 megawatts, so you're in tier 3, and say the lowest rate is inline hydro, it's 12 cents a kilowatt hour. If you can do a geothermal project for that rate, you can do it, or a biomass.
What's inline hydro?
It's hydro in a pipe, basically. It's where you have a county, or you have a system with the water's not in a river or stream, it's in a pipe, like some reservoir pipe or something like that. There's not a lot of it.
Yeah, I was going to say.
There's not a lot of it.
Maybe Kauai, and that's about it, right?
Big Island, there's a couple, but there's not a lot of it. So
What about onshore wind? Is that
onshore
your own home?
onshore wind is one of the 4.
Can that be your own home windmill? Can it be,
Yes, we call it small wind, and it would qualify for tier 1. There's a rate for tier 1. So the rates are critical. That's why you honed in on that, right? Rates are absolutely critical. How much am I going to make, and can I get financing for it? So there's many kinds of feed-in tariffs around the world. The best ones have differentiated rates. Instead of having one rate for solar, wind, hydro, and everything, which is hard, we actually had extensive proceedings with expert testimony on here's a typical wind project, here's a typical solar. Solar rates are much higher than wind rates, for example. Why? Because proposed wind rates are much lower, I should say, because some of the evidence indicates that would be appropriate. So that's the differentiated rates part. Cost plus reasonable profit, that's a very, very important part of the whole feed-in tariff. The commission is right now determining what does it cost to do a wind project in your home. You want to do small wind. How much does it cost you? And what's a reasonable profit? You should get a reasonable profit. This is why the feed-in tariff has revolutionized renewable energy around the world. You get cost plus a reasonable profit. What happened in Germany, everybody went out and looked any roof they could see anywhere in their neighborhood, anywhere. They're driving down the road, they stop. I want to put a system on your roof. Let me lease your roof. There's panels everywhere in Germany because of the feed-in tariff. Why? Because I get my cost plus a reasonable profit. And it's a 20-year contract, and I make a little money, and we meet our goals. The sticking point in the feed-in tariff docket and in general for renewable energy is that we have isolated island grids. Our grids are not interconnected to mainland sources. You can't take energy from another grid in case of the emergency or whenever you need it. You can't export, you can't import. They're small, isolated grids, and this creates major issues for putting renewable energy on the grid. So feed-in tariff is like right in the middle of that very challenging set of circumstances. But feed-in tariff, we'll come back to that, I'm sure. Whenever I've given this talk, the majority of the conversation goes to the feed-in tariff. People just sense, oh my gosh, that's a great idea. I can do a project. My uncle can do a project. It's like, we can all do this, and we'll have panels everywhere. And it'll be a good thing. It captures the imagination. There's a kind of egalitarian sort of aspect that's really intriguing. And Hawaii, like I said, city of Gainesville, Florida has a feed-in tariff. I mean, California, it depends on how you define it. California has had standard offer contracts since the 80s, but a true feed-in tariff, so to speak, Hawaii will be one of the first. Vermont is a little bit ahead of us right now. Ontario is doing a huge one in Canada. They're taking off in Asia. I'll mention that in just a second. This is an example of a solar PV system, kind of system you might see installed through a feed-in tariff. This is a commercial rooftop PV at Kona Commons, much larger system that could possibly also qualify under the feed-in tariff. Okay, and then I mentioned Asia Pacific, just focusing here in Hawaii as we are in the Pacific Rim, adopted in Australia, China, India, Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, and this is just the Asian. You know, Europe, of course, Europe is sort of where the feed-in tariff really took off, particularly in Germany, Spain, and France. They pioneered it and Germany's had tremendous success. They have the same insolation as Alaska. You know, they have the same sunlight as Alaska, but they've got a huge amount of solar PV, primarily due to the government deciding we're going to subsidize PV to a certain extent. We're going to give people this cost plus reasonable profit, and it's going to cost them about, you know, there's different estimates, basically like an extra $1 a month. That cost is a huge issue here as well as everywhere else. What's the ratepayer impact? Are your rates going to go up a lot? Is it going to be short-term, long-term? The Commission here has concluded over the long term, feed-in tariff will be beneficial to ratepayers. But everybody knows that in the short term, rates may go up. The question is how much. In Germany, there's you know, competing calculations, but some of them say, well, it's about $1 a month for the feed-in tariff.
If I'm not mistaken, I think the current discussion about the feed-in tariff being a set rate without an escalator, and it seems like in order to help control those costs as time goes forward, they want to have an escalator starting early.
Yes.
I was curious why that discussion didn't go that direction.
Well, that's exactly, that discussion did take place. The procedural posture, just to give you the kind of, basically it's been briefed and argued, and we're waiting for a decision from the Commission, but in the course of briefing it and arguing it, we had that same discussion. The Commission ruled, in a prior ruling, September 25th, 2009, they said no escalator. But yes, of course, you could do a rate that escalates, right? That's a good idea. It helps the project developer say, okay, I'm going to get an inflation-based escalation in my rate. The Commission said, we're not going to do that this time. We're just going to have a rate that we think will endure for that. And tax credits, if tax credits change, then the rate may change. But in other words, they're looking at a provision that would give the Commission the ability to change the rate based on tax, solar tax credits is what it changes.
So do I understand that feed-in tariffs in general are larger than avoided costs?
Yes, exactly. Avoided costs, for those who are not familiar with that term, it basically just means that beginning in the United States in particular, in the 80s, 90s, and until today, the basic idea is like, you can make a utility buy this solar, this kind of alternative energy, but you can't make the utility pay more than they would pay for oil. If I'm going to avoid using oil and you're going to make me buy this solar stuff under PURPA or some other federal statute, that's okay. However, I don't have to pay you more than the avoided cost. Feed-in tariff is yes, it's above avoided cost, and this is a somewhat contentious legal issue with regard. There's a lot of nuance. We're not FERC. We're not interstate commerce in Hawaii, so we're not regulated by FERC, and so there's some interesting legal issues around the avoided cost issue. But basically, the Commission has said yes, rates can be above avoided cost. So yeah. So let's look at the one in China, $148 billion feed-in tariff from November 2008. They had this landmark renewable energy law in January 2006. There's some nuances, not quite like the Hawaii feed-in tariff, but some interesting things. Sometimes my understanding, which could be incorrect, is that in some cases, they've actually set the rate after the project's done. So there's a sense that the government is encouraging some of these projects and trying to use the feed-in tariff policy as a mechanism to encourage the development. Importantly for China, they can register it as a CDM, a clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol to help establish their compliance with the Kyoto Protocol. It's viewed positively by foreign wind manufacturing investors in China. So let's just leave it at that and say that China's feed-in tariff is an example of what China is doing to promote clean energy. The details of what they're doing are not that instructive for what we're trying to do in Hawaii, I think. But the more interesting, I think, and important thing is that China is moving aggressively to dominate clean energy technology and economic development in the next, for the foreseeable future. $738 billion they've committed to spend over the next 10 years in supporting local industries. It's rather remarkable. In the last 2 years, they've just simply, there's been a sea change, and they've moved aggressively into this space. They are now, of course, Germany's solar PV manufacturing facilities were highly successful and to a certain extent subsidized by the government, it's my understanding. Guess what happened? China's now #1 solar PV manufacturer. They're making more solar panels than the Germans now. The wind turbines in China, they're also cranking out the wind turbines. When I was there in May in Shanghai, I had some interesting conversations with people about how they could build the wind machines, but they did not have the licenses for the electronic components of the wind machines, and that was kind of an issue. Getting the rights, getting the intellectual property rights to those electronic components of the wind machines was kind of a stumbling block, I think, for the Chinese manufacturers at that time. India also doing a huge feed-in tariff. They linked it directly to their National Action Plan on Climate Change. And it's being developed through their Central Electric Regulatory Commission, and it's just like us, they've got a regulatory docket going here. Includes all renewables and 25-year contract. So it's just another example of two very large emerging economies embracing the feed-in tariff as a powerful tool. Hawaii, obviously, we're so tiny by comparison, absolutely tiny. I just participated in a symposium in Japan, and we talked about, of course, the panelists and the audience wanted to talk only about the feed-in tariff. That was the topic, but we could all sort of conclude, despite the fact that Hawaii is tiny, relatively speaking, and Japan, of course, has a feed-in tariff, how we're all confronting many of the same issues. In my mind, I've come to sort of think of a China model and an other than China model, in the sense that China is, because of state capitalism, the way that state government operates and promotes and encourages in a close relationship with industry, they're moving very aggressively forward in the clean energy world. In the U.S. and in Japan, also to a certain extent, I think we find that there are pockets of resistance, and there are efforts to go slow, more of a go slow approach. So there's a kind of a contrast that can be drawn between the way that these countries are approaching. RPS, also a major driver here in Hawaii. This is a law that requires the utility to purchase certain percentages of renewable energy by a certain time. RPS is sort of the opposite. Feed-in tariff is like free market, people will do this. RPS is like, we better tell the utility, we better establish numeric standards for the utility to give them requirements, targets they have to hit. Net energy metering and tax incentives are critical for the smaller projects. Some of you have heard of net energy metering, often confused with the feed-in tariff. Net energy metering is when you put a system on your house and you use it to kill your load. You put a system on your house to generate enough electricity for your own use, and then if you have a little left over, you put it back on the grid. Very popular right now. Feed-in tariff is different. Feed-in tariff is, hey, I'm gonna lease that rooftop and get it set up and make some money doing it. But of course, tax incentives are a hugely important factor as well, mostly because they can change. Large projects, Kahiava on Maui, are emerging as critical components. The legislature recognized this and passed 201N, renewable energy siting process, established a renewable energy facilitator. The idea is like permits can be difficult to get in Hawaii for any kind of development project. Let's make it a little bit easier for renewable energy project developers. We have a Josh Strickler, who's a facilitator. You can meet with him. He'll show you the 140 permits that you're going to need, the checklist, and begin to work with you to develop a permit plan application. And the law imposes some kind of a time deadlines for not automatic approval. I say automatic approval is kind of like that, but basically, essentially it is an automatic approval if you push it to its extreme. But basically the idea is permitting agencies need to know this is a priority, and the law is tailored toward that.
What's the name of the renewable energy facilitator?
Josh Strickler. Josh Strickler. And then, of course, energy efficiency. The other part of clean energy, renewable energy plus energy efficiency. We have, I mentioned RPS a moment ago. We also have EEPS. What is it? Nobody knows. We're actually in a docket right now trying to figure that out. How do you have energy efficiency portfolio standards? What is it? How do you measure it? Who's responsible? We're trying to figure all that out now. The 70% by 2030, 40% is renewable energy, 30% is energy efficiency. 40% renewable, 30 efficiency. So you got to be able to measure, quantify, and demonstrate you've got that 30% energy efficiency by 2030. And the EEPS will help to do that. I threw in a couple things here. Some of you may know if you sell your house, you have to disclose how much electricity it consumes. You have to show the bills. These are little things. This is, of course, solar water heater is a huge issue. We've got, those are required now in new homes. That's a major efficiency boost. And then clothesline, this is the right to dry. You have the right to dry in Hawaii. If you live in a townhouse or someplace that has a planned community or community association, you want to hang your clothes out to dry, they can't tell you that you can't hang your clothes out to dry. They can.
That's really true, because my apartment, I like
Apartment?
to hang my clothes out.
It might be different.
But
Townhouse.
But I'm renting from someone, but it's a condo,
Oh, okay.
yeah. And the rules for the condo say that you can't hang your clothes out, and I want to hang my clothes out,
Uh-huh.
so.
I think I better give you my card.
Yes.
No, so yeah, basically in Hawaii
Okay.
you have the right to dry. It's sort of a time, it's like the Constitution, time, manner, and place. You can regulate how they do it. Like you can't, you can make it so it looks okay, but you can't forbid somebody
Does
from.
energy efficiency include retrofit types of activities?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, that's going to be a bigger issue. The green
So
bill.
additives, catalysts, retrofits.
It could. Depends on where you're talking, which part of energy efficiency you're talking about. Green building law and policy real quickly. We do have a green building law. State buildings have to be designed to meet LEED Silver. Most architects in Hawaii, some of us have heard of LEED Silver, I think. So this is one of the drivers on the efficiency side. And also priority permitting, county building permitting for LEED Silver buildings. Although I haven't been able to find yet much information on who's used that or with what level of success on the county level. But it's in the law. Counties are supposed to give you priority. Got about 21 certified and 159 registered projects. I just wrote an article for the Bar Journal on green building law. That's what I came up with 3 months ago. It's probably changed. I'm sure it's changed. Someone here may even know what the current head count is, but about 21 certified and 159 registered LEED. And then transportation, just real quickly. Well, we want to encourage EVs. I will say my next car will probably be an electric vehicle. That's just my sense. I mean, I think things are moving sort of in that general direction. Still, right now, tiny fraction of cars on the road are EVs, but there's a certain direction that's taking shape slowly. This law, this is from 2009, Act 156, requires EV parking spaces. If you got a large parking lot, you have to dedicate spaces to electric vehicles, just like handicap stalls. You have to mark it out, and it has to be obvious, and you have to provide charging. That's the trick. It's not just painting lines. You have to actually provide a facility so they can recharge. 1% by 2012, 2% for every 5,000 EVs after that, and then additional 1% till EVs are 10% of the total cars registered in Hawaii. So basically just kind of increasing how many parking spaces have to be EV parking spaces. You can consolidate. If you or your client or whoever you work with is a large entity that has a bunch of parking spaces, you can consolidate that, so that's good. You get a ticket, you get a citation, and then those of you who don't obey these kinds of rules habitually will get a ticket eventually if you don't. If you park in the wrong space. It shows a charging station and a license plate. Okay. All right. Thank you for your patience through all this barrage of law and policy. Major transition is underway now. Of course, again, show of hands. How many of you think, I will ask two questions. How many of you think a major transition is underway, and how many of you think is not? Starting with, how many think a major transition is underway? Okay. How about is not? How about undecided? All right. Okay. Well, it's different with every group. You guys seem to be more positive about this actually happening. Maybe you're a little more educated on the issues. And I think why? Because it's kind of it's a rare time where we want to do the right thing for the environment with climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, and also you've got to think about sea level rise and adaptation. I mean, there are certainly going to be some real, some distinct physical, changes that we're going to experience almost on a daily basis. So we want to do the right thing in that regard, especially for future generations. And it's costing us a huge amount of money. I mean, building the infrastructure for clean energy is expensive. Doing all of that is very expensive. Is it as expensive as $6.21 billion a year? So I mean, this is very expensive. Using imported fuel is costly, and we have the climate change thing driver. So I think this is sort of why we have this transition taking place. And again, it's funny. I think it's more obvious to people outside of Hawaii, and oftentimes than it is to us who live here. Because you go elsewhere and people are like, wow, of course Hawaii's doing this, right? You're the sun, the wind, and you're in the middle of the ocean? I mean, you have to be the model for the world, right? So there's a potential for us indeed to do that, and hopefully if we are able to, it will be to our advantage and the advantage of all of us in many different ways. So that concludes my talk.
Your timing is absolutely, my God.
Oh, good. All right.
Before-
I didn't leave time for questions?
No, but what I'd like to do is, because I tell people that at 1:15 we'll
they can.
get back.
Oh,
But a lot of
sorry.
people would like to stay.
Oh,
and
I'm
ask
sorry,
questions
okay.
if they may.
Yeah, I'd
But
like to-
Before we do that, I would like
Oh.
to present you with our gift, our official, authentic Harvard Cup Centennial whatever mug.
As a Yale graduate, I'm not sure what to do with it. I'm sure I will find a good use for it, though. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Please leave if you need to get back, otherwise stay and ask questions.
Yeah, I apologize. I thought there was more time for questions, and happy to stay and chat.
Is there a way to get money out of carbon credits? Is there a way to, I don't understand, for countries that aren't in the international carbon credit, is there a way to make money out of carbon credits here?
Oh, in Hawaii.
Yeah.
I believe the McCandless Ranch was in the paper recently in that regard. The owners of the ranch were able to. Does anyone remember reading that article recently? McCandless Ranch. They were able to arrange, because they're keeping their forest intact. They agreed to not harvest the forest, which is a carbon sink, and they were able to get credit for that through an international consortium that facilitates the exchange of those kind of credits. So, I think so. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it's
So
not.
you go to one of the international certifying organizations, and you get the credits, and you can sell it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the U.S., that's right. We don't have, and at a state level, we don't have that either yet. Sorry, Bill.
Is someone keeping track in some graphic way of sort of import substitution of sector businesses?
Probably DBED, if anybody. But what do you mean by
There'll
imports?
be a chart saying, here's the gross export of dollars for fuel, for carbon-based fuel. Here's what we're import substituting out by providing other locally based energy sources. We're now not exporting, another $1 billion, and we're now growing. So we're not renting our fuel anymore.
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
now
yeah.
growing.
Yeah.
Building it.
I haven't seen that, but it makes sense to me, and I would.
It'd be an interesting way for people to have a metric of
Yeah.
how we're accomplishing this.
That's really, that's a very interesting question, because we're actually in the EEPS docket, the one I mentioned where we're like, we don't know what is EEPS, is we're actually discussing what's the appropriate metric for measuring, and one of the proposals is to look at barrels of oil as a very simple, easy to grasp metric. How many barrels are coming into Hawaii, and how many are we able to reduce the number coming in?
You have to set it off though against what the overall generation of energy is.
You have to normalize it for various factors. That's right. That's exactly right. But I think DBED is the one that's doing they're keeping track of the economic, statistics and that kind of thing. That's one of the parties in the EPS docket said it should be on the news every night, on the weather report. There should be a little widget in the bottom of the screen showing barrels of oil. Yeah, you like that idea?
I like that idea.
All right, I'll relay that.
Raise this content.
I'll relay that to the other parties. That's a popular idea at the Harvard Club.
So I've been looking at what New Zealand's doing, which is pretty remarkable. They seem to be, just like we're thinking about it, they're doing it, yeah. And one of their targets is HVAC. But I don't see, I see some very, very general statements in Hawaii.
No,
Hawaii laws
the
about
energy
HVAC.
code. No, the energy code.
The energy code?
Yeah,
is where
and I didn't have
they're
time to talk
okay.
anything about that, but we have a state energy code. It's fairly recent. Actually, others here must know much more about this than I do, I imagine. But yes, we now have a state energy code partly to address the different county codes, which were not necessarily harmonized and so forth, and partly to adopt more stringent energy efficiency measures found in nationally developed and even internationally developed codes. So those codes directly affect HVAC. And so that's going to be it's kind of analogous to the climate change. Climate change is kind of slowly ratcheting down. I think the same kind of thing is happening with energy codes, relative to LEED even. LEED is for, people, it's for projects that can want to step forward and do the exemplary sort of type of a project for various reasons. The code is sort of coming from the bottom, sort of from the other direction, which is just forcing people to make these kind of changes to increase efficiency, HVAC in particular.
The LEED being adopted is mandatory by many governments, military, federal government,
Yeah, that's
state buildings.
Yeah. Although, our statute is written so that you don't have to get certification. You just have to design it equivalent to LEED Silver, which is kind of interesting because they have to avoid antitrust concerns.
Yeah, because it even says and other systems.
Exactly. But yeah, this is a debate from what I gather.
Because it actually takes a lot of time and costs money to go through the process. So if you
Yeah.
achieve it without getting this certification, but you've done all this stuff,
Mhm.
then I think that's probably the reason for it.
Yeah. You may know much more about this, and I picked up a little discussion. Well, actually, let me think. There was actually a challenge, I think it was in New Mexico, there was litigation over the government imposing LEED on as a standard, and the challenge was basically, hey, you can't require us to do a private, it's sort of a private standard, that kind of thing. So there's some.
Arizona. That happened in Arizona. I don't know.
Is it Arizona?
Maybe New Mexico.
Oh,
too,
okay,
but
maybe I'm
it's in
misremembering.
Arizona.
But I know. I mean, it's like LEED is everywhere. LEED is clearly predominant, and for good reason, right? And governments know that. Like the legislature said, yeah, LEED Silver, got to do. And City and County of Honolulu also 5,000 square feet and above, LEED Silver, right? So, yeah. But on the energy codes, it seems to me, or maybe Howard Wigg just influenced me too much. He's a state energy code expert, and I met with him recently, and he's painting a picture of the code really driving efficiency as well.
Yeah. I'm not familiar, but in general, the state is attempting to consolidate and regularize the disparities between all the different counties and all kinds of codes right now.
Including like fire and other. Yeah.
The state building code.
I'm sorry, you had a question back here?
Yeah, I mean, actually, this is just to kind of broaden the issue a bit. To what extent do you find that other concerns beyond just energy efficiency, climate change, and economics are entering into the discussion? I mean, three things that come to mind right away is that, you know, I just moved to Hawaii, and there are many states that allow billboard advertising, for instance, which you don't have here, which I think can be an eyesore. And the same thing, let's say they had wind turbines in the park, would that actually adversely affect the economy of the whole state? Or even people hanging their clothes out on their balconies, you know, I can see that in some cases it could be an eyesore. If I owned an apartment building,
Yeah.
I wouldn't want people just hanging their clothes on the railings and having it blow away or not blow away, or, you know. Are these questions also coming up in the discussion?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because what I hear you saying is that basically there's just a whole, I mean, this was a law and policy kind of a talk, but there's just a whole bunch of other considerations. Because why? Because energy affects all of us so intimately. I mean, everything we do. And so, like, the aesthetics issues, there's so many different issues that come into play. Aesthetics, personal preference, it's very complicated. We've been used to doing things one way for a long time. You know, we've been used to having central station. You just flip the light switch and...
Yeah, but you know, I mean, when you talk about Germany with these panels on every roof, let's say in Gstaad, Switzerland, if you had panels on every roof, no one would go there anymore, because the whole point is that it's a beautiful, charming area with these little cottages, you know. And so to what extent, you know, I mean, in Germany, yes, but if we saw panels everywhere in Hawaii or wind turbines everywhere, because we could all make $5, you know, instead of, let's say, having efficient public transportation, which I find greatly resistant here, even though I come from New York, where everyone uses it because it's the best way to get around and it is efficient.
Right. You know, I think what I see, hopefully this responds somewhat to your question, is there's like a lot of different options and a lot of different ways, and we're all engaged in this massive struggle to figure out which ones are the cheapest and most efficient.
Yeah,
some of these
and
things,
most efficient might be very different, though.
they could be. But I mean, my point is just it's not clear right now, because there are some options that seem to have really negative aesthetic and environmental and community. You know, and you can see they're going to fall away. They're not going to make it to the finish line. And some options, there may be some and of course, related to that, of course, is technological, you know, optimism, which springs eternal, which is that, you know, somebody's going to invent this magic device that's going to make it so we don't really have to do anything different than we are. So, but I don't know if that responds to your question.
No, I know it does. I was just curious, you know, if...
These are complex. These are incredibly this is a tiny, tiny snapshot of law and policy. They're very complex issues.
You had said it toward the beginning when you talked about the passage of the bill that none of us had heard of, that they may want to postpone the rulemaking process, and that you would explain why later.
Oh.
Did you ever get back to that? I didn't know. Maybe I wasn't listening.
Yes, just only because the task force concluded that HCEI could achieve the goal of the statute, and therefore maybe you don't need rules. Now, I should be very clear to all of you. I have no idea what I mean, they may be working on it right now. I really don't know. The last I'd heard, it was unclear whether they were going to do that. I mean, certainly they have a statutory requirement, so they're not going to just ignore it. I mean, they would go. I assume they would have to go to the legislature and try to convince them that, you know. So, but they could be working on them right now, for all I know. So, yeah. Sorry. Please.
I just asked, I mean, I hope this doesn't make sense, but I agree with what you're talking about. But I'm also worried, you know, when we see cost plus and things like that, and we paying the highest amount in energy for electricity, all of this coming into play, I imagine someday when we're all totally solar power, it won't matter, but I have a joke, because tomorrow I have to tell people in the Rotary Club that there's a brand new car created by Porsche. It's a Spider 618 that gets 78 miles per gallon and 0s to 60 and in something like 3 seconds flat, and goes 200 miles an hour. And it's a hybrid. it gets 78 miles per gallon.
Uh-huh.
Only problem, it costs $675,000. When you figure that out.
That's a lot of
you're kinda
gas.
like, whoa. Yeah, so I'm just wondering how
Yes,
that all
yes.
fits together in this thing, because I assume Central Station versus the feed-ins are a little less expensive, economics in terms of generating.
Well, I think the short answer is no one knows right now. I mean, except for they know that that rates are going to go up, most likely. It's going to be expensive. To do the transition, it will be expensive. I mean, that's my sense. And how do you do that equitably? How do you do that reasonably? How do you protect people who can't afford a rate increase? You know, parts of our community that cannot afford that. It's to me, it's just a huge transition. Going from where we are now to where we probably will be is just a huge, expensive transition. And so, yeah, I mean, actually, when I gave this similar talk in Singapore at a conference, the word that came out immediately was subsidies. And the whole discussion was a big, you know, we don't like subsidies, or we do like subsidies, or we should give them, or we shouldn't give them. So it's contentious and very difficult. The basic premise is, I mean, reducing it to a bumper sticker, you know, the cost issue, people say it's so expensive, and I will say compared to what? And that's where, you know, in other words, fundamentally, you have to think about what are the options, and we have imported fossil fuels. We're doing coal, too. Many people don't know that we have a large coal-fired power station here on Oahu. AES puts out 180 megawatts. So it's like, how much does that cost? And then to build all these solar panels, windmills, to redo the grid. You know, the grid is like, it's like if you look at like a TV from the 1950s,